it's a truism that mobility of people, goods and information is essential to functioning and thriving of cities and the people living or spending time there. At the same time, urban mobility, a term that I think is broader than simply transportation, is associated with many challenges or ills, from greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution to being a major contributor to social inequality by providing people with highly uneven access to employment, education, healthcare, social networks and so forth, to urban sprawl and the policy favorite, congestion. Many visions of the good city therefore focus on the mobility or circulation of people, goods and information. Partially as a result of colonialism, the imagining of mobility in the good cities around the world has been heavily dependent on Western ideas, concepts and practices, both in research and in planning. Though I should stress, of course, that the term Western is fuzzy and rather incoherent in the context. Sometimes it can refer to US-style automobility and the valorization of the flyover across the world. More often and increasingly, though, it is about European-style rail integrated transport systems and more recently cycling infrastructure. So Copenhagen, Amsterdam are now seen as the global examples of how you would do sustainable transport infrastructure. Another caveat is, of course, that Western concepts, ideas and practices are not the only ones that have diffused spatially. There are sort of concepts that are labeled as southern, like bus rapid transit, and increasingly, of course, in the 21st century, it's Chinese practices, Chinese models that are diffusing rapidly, not least because China is very keen on subsidizing, financing infrastructure development projects across the world that might otherwise not have been realized. I think it was last week only that there was a very interesting article in The Guardian about Sri Lanka, which is one of the countries that is now firmly indebted to China and Chinese funding agencies because of the infrastructure development that's taking place. So despite all of this, I would say there are all kinds of contradictions at the heart of Western concepts and logics for reconfiguring urban mobility through technology or otherwise. On the one hand, for instance, there's a desire to reduce externalities like congestion, pollution, and so forth. On the other hand, there's also an explicit drive to encourage economic growth. And economic growth often means also more mobility. So there's a whole set of tensions around how much CO2, for instance, is actually saved. Also, a lot of technology-heavy interventions in urban mobility are sort of raise awkward questions around social justice, for instance. If you want to stimulate electric vehicles and you put in place a whole finance system of subsidies, who is actually benefiting from that? You could very easily argue that that is a very neat way of subsidizing the middle and upper classes in contemporary cities. Given all this, more and more people are now arguing that we need new modes of thinking and acting in relation to mobilities that are cognizant of colonialisms and neo-colonial intricacies and that are sensitive to context whilst also being translocal. And I tend to use the term differently global in this context. And my thinking is quite influenced by developments in urban geography, urban studies more generally, where people like Emmanuel Roy speak about worlding. Now, compared to urban studies, worlding or differently globalizing is really in its infancy when we're looking at transport and mobility research. There's still a lot to be done. Now, the point of differently globalizing is not so much to critique, however easy that may sometimes be when we see the infrastructure-heavy, tech-heavy, techno-economic and narrowly engineering-focused approaches that prevail in quite a few places, as here in a city in sub-Saharan Africa that shall remain unnamed otherwise. It is, following decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo, to offer an option to imagine, render intelligent and support new practices, institutions and policies that seek to address the wicked problems associated with urban mobility. The question is, of course, how to do that. particularly when you're in an institution with a history of colonialism that is as checkered as this one. So there are all kinds of ways you can do it. I think we at the Transport Studies unit try to do it in two main ways. One is about capacity building through research and our education. I can talk more about that later if time allows. The other is to develop a different breed of transport and mobility scholarship that builds on different philosophical, theoretical and methodological frameworks than those that prevail in transportation studies and planning in the North and the South, and B, draw attention to processes, events and initiatives that remain beyond the purview of conventional transportation studies and mainstream planning discourse. And this slide gives examples of such scholarship that we've been engaged in. In the interest of time, I just want to focus on the third one. Let me just say that the first one about mobility biographies in Manila, I think is very interesting because it sort of challenges all kinds of Western ideas about how you achieve behavior change in urban mobility, because of how this kind of research has allowed us to rethink concepts of the household, gender relations, the nature of care, the relationship between care work and mobility. So I think there's a lot to learn from this kind of research. But as I said, I want to focus on this third strand of research, not least because this is funded by the ESRC and part of the Urban Transformations. Again, it's significantly influenced by the thinking on comparative urbanism. The focus is on cycling and walking because, in theory, these modes of transport have the greatest potential to be or become socially just. Now, that doesn't happen always, and actually this is an example of from York Boulevard in Highland Park, Los Angeles, where cycling infrastructure is being developed by property developers who sort of see it as one way of gentrifying neighborhoods. So what you see is that this potentially just type of infrastructure is being co-opted by sort of a whole set of in many ways, questionable practices of development. On the whole, however, I would say cycling and walking have the biggest potential to become socially just because they leave the smallest imprint on existing urban fabrics. There are few restrictions on access and on use of these kinds of forms of mobility, and they don't produce the same level of externalities in the form of congestion, pollution, noise, and so on that we see with other modes of transport. And the focus is on grassroots initiatives because they remain below the radar of almost all research in urban mobility, including much of the mobilities term research. I also find these initiatives very interesting because they're driven by considerations of social needs, environmental justice, and often enact a prefigurative urban politics. Through exemplification and their own practices, they not only seek to create better mobility systems, but better cities. More often than not, cycling and walking are not sort of the goal in and of themselves, but this is about addressing broader issues of inequality, of marginalization, ill health, commodification and privatization in the urban realm, violence, and so on. Now, there's a big, well, in this project we're looking at grassroots initiatives in London and Sao Paulo, and in both cities the diversity of initiatives is very, very large. I've just got a couple of pictures here. Two top ones are from Sao Paulo, and they happen to be sort of focused on walking infrastructures. But there are also many initiatives that focus on offering, for instance, bikeability training or bike maintenance training to women, gender variant people, offer them to refugees, illegal migrants, and so on and so forth. I think they're a very interesting set of initiatives. And I don't have to, I could talk about them for quite some time, but I just want to use the remaining time to make 2 points. First is that I think the appeal of comparing Sao Paulo and London is that the results from Sao Paulo really speak back to what we see, or rather wouldn't see so easily if we had only concerned ourselves with London. And in this sense, it's sort of a classic point of view. It sort of confirms some of the classic ideas from this comparative urbanism literature. And I think in this context, what is so interesting about the initiatives in Sao Paulo is that they're much more interconnected and interwoven than what we see in London. And we think that this has something to do with funding regimes, particularly because many of the initiatives in London are dependent on funding from local government, charities, and other organizations. But all of that funding is to be gained through competitive bidding. So what's happening is that these initiatives are being pitted against each other, and that's creating all kinds of divisions and forms of institutionalized suspicion and mistrust of each other. And I think this is really, in many ways, sad, because it goes against the ethos of what these initiatives try to do. And I think that in itself has also theoretical implications, because if we want to make sense of what these initiatives can do in the context of broader transitions in mobility, it means that we have to theorize not only how they are a critique of neoliberal urbanism, but also how they are constituted, partly constituted by processes of neoliberalism. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Another very interesting difference between Sao Paulo and London is that advocacy and research are much more interwoven in the Sao Paulo case than is in London. And that has real implications for what kinds of activities these initiatives pursue. So, more broadly, these findings have important ramifications for how we theorize mobility advocacy activism in the city. And I think they really sort of help us to resist the temptation of drawing on the experiences of cities like London, which are in many ways seen as exemplars of how you would do sustainable mobility policy. And I think that's a bonus. Secondly, I think our research forces us to theorize socio-technical transition processes in different, alternatively global ways. I don't have time to explain this whole diagram, but it's a very common, popular diagram in transition studies, innovation studies, where it's used extensively, and Frank Gales, who has drawn the diagram, is now one of the most highly cited social scientists. And I think it's done great work in terms of making the insights on transition scholarship accessible to a wider audience. But I think what our research suggests is that we need to think about social-technical regimes, that is the formal and informal institutions through which existing social-technical systems like automobility are reproduced, are much less internally homogeneous and path-dependent than they're usually considered to be. And the whole idea of strategic niche management needs to be reconfigured if we want to understand what's happening in a city like Sao Paulo. So, in sum, I think we need new modes of thought and action regarding urban mobility. And I've only been able to present just a drop in the ocean, but this is part of the nascent body of scholarship and praxis that will harness the value of everyday mobility in more socially just ways. Thank you very much.